Dominating the center from the outset establishes a strong positional foundation, controlling key squares for future piece development. Instantly challenging central pawn control and preparing for rapid piece development, Nf6 offers excellent flexibility. Securing central space and preparing to expand on the queen side, white asserts early dominance in the pawn structure. Embracing Fianchetto, black prepares to contest the center indirectly, but it cedes some central space for now. Developing a piece to its natural square fortifies the center and prepares for castling, aiming for a solid kingside structure. Developing the bishop to its natural diagonal, the Fianchetto posture reinforces the queenside and prepares for castling, while subtly questioning white's central pawn structure. Solidifying the pawn center and preparing Fianchetto development, this move seeks to control key diagonals and launch a kingside attack. Securing the king behind pawns is a vital step, harmonizing defense with impending central action. Developing the bishop locks down the dark squares, preparing a solid center. Solidifying the pawn chain, d6 prepares to support the central advance and activate the bishop. Securing the king within a robust pawn shield allows for a free hand in developing the queenside pieces and potentially challenging black's central aspirations. Nurturing the knight's retreat to d7 builds a solid pawn shield for the king, preparing for potential central pawn advances. Solidifying the center and preparing for knightly operations on either flank, this move offers flexibility, potentially eyeing c5 or e4 while defending its d4 pawn and maintaining central pawn structure integrity, setting the stage for a harmonious development symphony. Challenging the center immediately, black injects sharp central tension, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development by creating a pawn clash that could open crucial lines or lead to complex exchanges. Asserting central control, this pawn advance immediately challenges black's ambitious pawn push, aiming to either shatter the opponent's central pawn chain or secure a commanding presence in the d5 square. Solidifying the central pawn chain now, black prepares to reinforce the d6 pawn and potentially challenge white's e4 advanced presence. This establishes a robust structure, hinting at a long-term positional battle rather than immediate fireworks. Reinforcing the kingside structure prevents any immediate pawn advances and prepares for a potential kingside attack, while simultaneously keeping the bishop on g2 unblocked for future action. Asserting queenside pressure, this development immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and prepares for a potential kingside attack, forcing white to consider how best to defend or counter the looming threats across the board. Opening a diagonal for the queen bishop, while initiating a daring pawn thrust to disrupt black's queenside structure, creates dynamic imbalances. Embracing the pawn storm, black immediately challenges white's central expansion, opening lines that might accelerate development or invite tactical skirmishes, a bold decision to forego solidifying the pawn structure for immediate counterplay. Smashing open the center with this pawn capture immediately disrupts black's ambitions to seize more central space, creating an unbalanced pawn structure that will demand precise play from both sides as the queenside tension resolves. Re-establishing the knight's central presence and preparing a kingside pawn advance are the immediate goals after rerouting the knight via e8. Aims to activate the queen, leveraging the open c-file and preparing for potential central pawn pushes, while simultaneously pressuring black's isolated d-pawn and considering a future kingside attack. Black consolidates the pawn structure and prepares to challenge white's central space, aiming to untangle the knight from its cramped position. The knight's ambitious lunge to the edge of the board, na4, actively challenges the queenside structure and prepares to exploit the weakened c5 pawn. Hoping to exploit the slightly loose structure of white's queenside pawns, black aims to create immediate diagonal pressure against the c3 knight and potentially target the d4 pawn. Reinforcing the central pawn and preparing to contest the now open d-file, white signals an intent to dominate the middle game by bringing the rook into active play. The knight's retreat to e6 shores up the d4 pawn and aims to redirect towards the kingside, a more ambitious target than its previous outpost on d7. This repositioning signals a desire to increase pressure on white's central pawns and potentially prepare for a kingside assault, though it leaves the d6 pawn somewhat isolated for now. Shifting the bishop to its Fianchetto diagonal, white aims to activate this piece and potentially support a queenside expansion, while also keeping an eye on the central tension and black's king's safety. Black seizes the initiative by launching a pawn storm on the queenside, aiming to shatter white's central pawn structure and gain crucial space. This audacious advance, c4, aims to dislodge the knight on a4 and open critical diagonals for the queen and bishop. It's a bold attempt to disrupt white's well-coordinated pieces and create weaknesses, particularly around the kingside if white is forced to react defensively. Consider the dynamic implications. If white isn't careful, this pawn push could lead to an exposed king or a severely compromised pawn structure. Repositioning the bishop to f1 aims to untangle white's queenside, offering it a path to either h3 or g2 to support the kingside or challenge black's dark-squared control. The knight's bold plunge into the enemy camp initiates a fascinating tactical skirmish, potentially disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn chain and offering black a dynamic advantage if white isn't prepared to defend the weakened central squares precisely. The knight reclaims central territory, aiming to disrupt black's queen's ambition on b5 and solidify white's control over the d4 square. Reclaiming the central pawn with this recapture immediately challenges white's advanced e5 pawn, aiming to disrupt their promising central control and potentially open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen, which now enjoys a more active diagonal. Sacrificing material for a decisive positional advantage is the ambitious idea here. White has decisively resolved the pawn tension on the queen side, transforming it into an open position where the king's safety might become a critical factor. The exchange of pieces, particularly the removal of black's knight from its active c7 post, weakens the central pawn structure and opens lines for white's powerful queen. Black launches a knight into a seemingly exposed position, aiming to disrupt white's queenside initiative and exploit the tension created by the recent pawn exchange. Exchanging the bishop for the knight decisively surrenders control of the dark squares around black's monarch, a significant positional concession that could prove problematic later. The queen's reappearance on g5 injects immediate tactical vibrancy, forcing white to reevaluate the safety of their own king, which has been conspicuously left in the center while black's monarch enjoys the protection of a castled fortress. This capture isn't merely material recovery, it's a positional challenge, creating potential forks and exposing weaknesses in white's pawn structure, particularly the d4 pawn, which now lacks its usual d-pawn shield. Black is leveraging the open lines that have emerged from the recent pawn exchanges. A subtle repositioning aiming to exploit the potentially awkward placement of black's knight on g5, aiming to reroute the knight to a more menacing central post, perhaps targeting the d6 pawn indirectly or preparing a sortie towards black's kingside. Reclaiming central influence by bringing the bishop back into play, this piece now eyes the weakened light squares and offers potential support for the knight's advance. Unlocking the central tension, white aims to exploit black's potentially awkward knight placement and reinforce the queenside pawn structure. Shielding the king's immediate vicinity with this pawn advance subtly reinforces the queenside pawn structure, anticipating potential exchanges and offering a more robust defense against any incursions along the queenside open files that might arise if white continues to press. Aggressively attacking the black queen, white seeks to disrupt black's coordination and potentially trap the advanced knight on e6, while simultaneously creating a passed pawn on the kingside. Black fortifies the queenside, shoring up defenses on the b6 pawn and preparing to regroup the beleaguered knight from its awkward outpost on e5. Centralizing the queen to d6 is a strategic thrust aimed at controlling key squares and potentially creating new attacking avenues, while also forcing black to react and potentially exposing weaknesses in their pawn structure. Securing the open file with the rook is a logical step, preparing to contest the c-file and potentially create counterplay against white's queen. Swapping off the queen here simplifies matters dramatically, ushering in an endgame where black's potentially isolated queenside pawns might become a weakness down the line. Re-establishing the bishop on a more active diagonal opens up avenues for the rooks and potentially targets the isolated pawn structure, although it temporarily concedes some central control. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for kingside expansion, this move seeks to activate the f-pawn and potentially create new attacking avenues. The unleashed fianchettoed bishop now eyes the open c-file, preparing to challenge the opponent's influence on that crucial vertical, hinting at a potential shift in the battle for central control as pieces begin to simplify. Shifting the king to the second rank aims to secure it behind the pawns and activate the rook on the d-file. This move fundamentally addresses the king's safety, moving it from the potentially exposed central files towards the relative security of the queenside pawns. It's a prophylactic measure against any immediate kingside threats and prepares for potential rook maneuvers along the second rank should the opportunity arise. Furthermore, by vacating the initial king square, it opens up the d-file for further central pawn control or piece development should the game dictate such a path. It's a subtle yet significant repositioning, anticipating future pawn structures and potential exchanges. Relocating the rook to the d-file now seeks to contest a crucial open avenue, potentially creating new avenues of attack or consolidating pressure on white's slightly exposed monarch. Pushing the e-pawn here begins to crack open the center, aiming to gain space and potentially create attacking avenues for the remaining pieces, though it simultaneously exposes the king slightly to the g7 bishop's gaze. Boldly challenging the central pawn advance, black injects dynamism by opening the f-file for potential counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially exploit the now slightly exposed king's position. Initiating a bold cavalry charge with this knight aims to seize crucial central squares, disrupting black's pawn structure and potentially opening lines for further attack. Unlocking a critical central file by capturing the pawn creates a dynamic pawn structure, potentially leading to open lines for white's rook and bishop, and demanding black's careful attention to king's safety. A bold repositioning, this knight aims to disrupt black's suddenly unified queenside pawn structure by creating future infiltration threats along the third rank, while also preparing to redeploy to a more active square should the opportunity arise. Sacrificing the exchange of rooks now simplifies the position dramatically, aiming to transition towards a more manageable endgame where black's active pieces might prove more influential than white's central pawn majority. Reclaiming the central file immediately asserts your dominance after the exchange, preparing to mobilize your remaining pieces towards the queenside and initiate a flanking maneuver that could unravel black's defensive structure. Repositioning the bishop to d5 injects new life into black's queenside, aiming to challenge white's central pawn advances and potentially open lines for counterplay against the weak c2 square. The bishop's retreat to h3 initiates a subtle yet significant repositioning, seeking to exploit the now open g-file and potentially support a future pawn push with g4, aiming to disrupt black's kingside pawn structure. Establishing control of the open e-file is paramount here, as it will allow the rook to exert pressure on white's advanced pawn and potentially join an attack on the king if the opportunity arises. Striking the e-pawn at last, white aims to seize the initiative on the central files, forcing a response that could liberate black's rook and activate the bishop. Reclaiming the central file, black reestablishes a presence on the open territory, setting the stage for a complex endgame where precise pawn structure management will be paramount. Asserting dominance on the light squares, the bishop now directly challenges the opponent's monarch, forcing a critical decision that will significantly impact the pawn structure and piece activity for the remainder of this tense endgame. The black king, having just been checked, now ventures back onto the battlefield, seeking refuge and potentially offering an active role in the ensuing endgame struggles. Seizing control of the open d-file now solidifies white's presence, aiming to leverage the advantage in central pawn structure and the potential for a king's safety issue on the king side. A determined effort to activate the monarch, seeking a sanctuary from the immediate pressure and aiming to participate in the fight for central squares. Capturing the pawn on e5 reestablishes a strong central presence, forcing the black king into a more exposed position and preparing to advance the remaining pawns. Reclaiming the bishop's central influence, this retreat allows black to consolidate its forces and prepare for potential pawn advancements on the king side, aiming to disrupt white's bishop pair advantage. Pouncing on the exposed king, this knight sacrifice shatters black's central pawn shield, forcing a king repositioning and opening critical lines for white's remaining pieces to exploit. Opening the d-file for the rooks offers a chance to activate dormant pieces, but be mindful of the lurking knight on h7. Its potential for harassment shouldn't be underestimated. Reclaiming the outpost for the bishop opens a strategic avenue, now that the d-file has been cleared and the central pawns are stabilized, allowing white to re-establish active piece coordination and potentially target the weakened kingside structure. The king is now exposed in the center, and this aggressive check forces an immediate reaction, potentially leading to material loss or a worse position for white. Shifting the monarch offers a crucial escape route, anticipating any immediate threats and preparing for potential counterplay once the dust settles from this chaotic exchange. Seizing the open file with the rook after the capture provides crucial activity, potentially disrupting white's king's safety and initiating a dangerous counterplay. Sacrificing the bishop here nets a pawn and opens up the king's defenses even further, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawns and create a mating net. Seizing material, black snatches the rook on the queen side, a bold, tactical decision that shifts the balance of pawns, but leaves the king exposed to white's advancing pawn majority.